Wednesday, March 17th. Thanks for joining me for the Outlaw Pulpit. St. Augustine has been credited with the phrase, "The church is a whore, but she is still my mother." Something to think about, isn't it? Now, that statement has been debated whether or not he really did say that, but all credible sources point to him being known for saying that phrase. And it's a strong phrase. I used it once in a teaching that I did at Cornerstone Festival. Remember Cornerstone? Rest in peace. I was teaching a class there, and there were a couple other professors there teaching as well. And we got into the discussion of whether or not he really said that, because it seems a little bit out of character. But that's kind of what I want to go for today in my Outlaw Pulpit. And this one may get a little long, but bear with me because I want to talk about the church. The church is a topic that is talked about often in many podcasts, even ones here on Sanctuary International Matrix. And I want to talk about it because I pastor a brick and mortar church. So I'm not an evangelist that says Pastor Bob or anything like that. I pastor a literal church building full of people in central Wisconsin called Waupaca, Wisconsin, and it's a good church. But let me give you a little history on where I came from and why I have some, as I would say, authority to speak about such a subject. When I was 22 years old, I'm 46 now, I began being a youth pastor in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at a church there. For 8 years I stayed there. I didn't apply to be there. I never fill out an application or anything, submit a resume, nothing. They just saw my heart for teens and the things that I was doing in our community and asked if I would be willing to be their youth pastor. Well, that led to me basically getting this here, not my head, but that certificate. And that is my credential papers through the Assemblies of God. Now, 8 years I was there, and it was a church of about 80 people, and the youth group grew to about 85 kids within that congregation. And out of that, many of the kids didn't want to go to the adult service, and I don't blame them, but I'll digress on that. And so I began a college ministry as well, and that took off. We started seeing 12, 15 college kids. Kids that didn't want to leave youth group were old, and it gets weird. If you're 19 years old and still in youth group, check your heart. You need to get out of there. And so they moved over to the college ministry, and things were going well. Things were going great. But I started getting wrangled in a little more as the church moved into a new building, and they wanted all the events on the same night, and I didn't want that to happen because I knew that the night they wanted it on was a sports night. So I kind of bucked it a little bit, and I got pulled into a board meeting. 8 years at a church, and the first board meeting I got asked to attend was basically for them to tear into me. I remember specifically the pastor stating his case, and I tried to interject, and he said, "You will be quiet until you are spoken to." And at that point, I knew it was the beginning of the end. I knew that not only was I getting ready to head out, but there was something more. There was an elephant in the room that he was dealing with as well. Well, a few weeks, maybe a couple months later, he admitted to the Assembly of God that he was struggling with internet and morality issues and meeting with people and unfaithfulness and all of that. And he was asked to leave. And so he did. And it was during that time that the board decided to pull a power trip and ask me to basically lay low. Like I'm not allowed to do anything. They had originally said you're the interim pastor, but take it with a grain of salt if you're on staff and they ask you to be the interim pastor. They don't usually mean that. But long story short, it was very difficult for me to stay. I submitted my resume because I loved that church and I wanted to be the pastor of it. And the interim pastor that they did bring in took me out to lunch one Sunday, and he goes, "So how are things?" And I told him, I said, "We submitted our resume." He goes, just do yourself a favor and pull that resume. You see, during this time when they forced me to change youth nights, our attendance in youth ministry went from 85 to 12 within 2 weeks. We tanked. And they basically told me that they do not want me starting another church, and I had no intentions at the time. It was to complement that of what was going on there already. And so I pulled my resume, and then I submitted my resignation, and then I moved to Waupaca. And Here I was the youth pastor as well. Same story. Church was only about 40, but we had about 75 to 80 kids coming out to our LAN parties. Remember those with Xboxes? We had Halo LAN parties. We had dodgeball tournaments, all sorts of things. And about a year into that, the pastor got caught in a sting operation. And so it got very ugly once again. I was asked to be the interim pastor, and so I did. And I was able to function as an interim pastor. But when he ultimately was asked to leave by the Assemblies of God, he basically told the church I kicked him out, and it was just an ugly situation. I say all of that as the backdrop to say I get it that churches can be awful places at times. I totally get it. If I had one person from Focus on the Family say, Bob, what you went through in ministry within 2 years, most pastors don't experience in a lifetime. And I totally got that. And the fact is, when the acting superintendent of the Assemblies of God asked me to pastor the church I'm at now, currently, I told him in not so nice words exactly where I thought the whole church model could go. And he said, well, why don't you just think about that a little bit and get back to me? He was a longtime friend of my family. So I did, and I accepted, and it was tough. Things, when you're handed a church with a mortgage and only 8 people attending, every week's a nail biter, and you start doing things that you've never done to get people you've never had. I realize that's a cliche phrase, but we lived it. My upbringing was from a church of stability. It was a German district church. It was solid. It was solid givers. Every week was given. The giving was above and beyond budget. People, I don't remember them necessarily doing a whole lot of outreach. But then my wife came from a church that did outreach. It was solid. Pastor has been there for years. And then we moved into this mess storm. There's other words for that. And it really got tough. And so I get it when people say, I'm giving up on church. I don't want to go to church. People aren't nice there and everything. And I get that. But there's also a side of me that says, get over yourself. Because there are people that also will say, well, my upbringing was horrible. I was forced to go to church. Well, so was I. Even Father Richard Rohr, who wrote the book Falling Upward, Franciscan priest, he wrote a book regarding how important it is to have a solid foundation. And this foundation is really what lays the bedrock for our life. And there comes a point where you don't need that anymore. And this is what Richard Rohr would call the second phase of life, where you don't need the security. You've built up your ego in a good way and all these things. And now you just coast knowing who you are. But every Sunday, my dad and mom, they'd get in the car, we had to go with, and it wasn't an option. Even up until we were 18 years old, it wasn't an option to go to church. And if you were sick, my dad could usually tell if you were really telling the truth or not. And if he knew you weren't telling the truth, he'd say, well, go throw up, get back in the car, and don't forget your Bible on the way out. And you know what? I look at that, and a lot of people would tag that as spiritual abuse, all of these things, whatever. It was parents being good parents and us basically instilling in us the value of being a part of a church. Now, I realize as adults, things can get hard and can stay hard in churches as well. Man, I've gone through so much stuff in ministry at this little church. People spreading rumors, people leaving, people coming, staying, hiring a youth pastor, gone the next week, all of this stuff. I get it. It's tough. But there's something very beautiful about the local church. I went to a conference once, and the conference was simply called Isn't She Beautiful? And it was a talk about the local church and how it really is the heartbeat of Jesus in the New Testament. It was Acts chapter 2, the start of the New Testament church started. It was the church that helped Paul, the Apostle Paul, sustain in prison. Those prisons were the type that if you didn't have anybody that loved you, well, you're not going to get fed and you will eventually die. That's how prisoners were taken care of. Paul had the church. He had people coming in and supplying them with meals and all sorts of things. And so I realize church gets tough, but sometimes we bring that on ourselves. Whether we've been in a church setting for a little while and been burned and then we come back, we can sometimes put a wall up. And so we walk into this new church like a man or a lady walks into a new relationship after breaking up or divorcing somebody. You tend to look at that person or that church as the one you just broke up with, when in fact, this is a new entity, this is a new person, this is a new thing. And those preconceived notions that we bring into the church can oftentimes make it a tarnished experience. Or people will leave a church that they've been a part of for years, come to, let's say, Radiant Fellowship, where I pastor, and they expect it to be their church, but in a new version or new format. And that isn't the case. I remember one time my youth pastor, he resigned when I was in youth group, and the new youth pastor came in and he goes, "Hi, I'm Carlo. I'm not Dave." In other words, he's not the former youth pastor. He is Carlo. He is the new guy. Get to like him, and all of that. And so that can happen with churches as well, where we bring over this mindset of the other church we left, and we expect somehow this church to be the same thing. It's not going to be. But that's where, as author Mike Yaconelli from Zondervan Publishers, who passed many years ago, he wrote a book called Messy Spirituality. And in his book, he said, we have to learn to adapt to our situations. I talked to a few goth people once, here and there. A lot of metalheads. I talked to a lot of metalheads. And inevitably, some of them will say, well, I went to church and they all stared at me weird. Well, yeah. I mean, most churches, let's face it, most churches are pretty much a contemporary feel. They just are. There are some that try to have that millennial touch, and they'll have couches set up and things like that, and the 20, 30-year-olds dressed like they just walked out of American Eagle and stuff. That's fine, But let's face it, most churches are that way. But that doesn't mean they're bad, okay? That really doesn't mean they're bad. But when you walk into a church, let's say that's American Eagle, and you're all gothed up, well, you know what? Of course they're going to stare at you. Now, what you need to remember is that they're staring at you because you're different, and that's okay. That's to be celebrated. God made you that way. You can be different, but you don't look like them. And so you are going to get some responses. And let's be honest here. I mean, let's just be stinking honest here. If you have full sleeve tattoos, you're wearing black eye makeup, mascara, whatever the case may be, you want to be noticed. I mean, you do. You just do. And so you have to expect it. You're welcoming that. And for a lot of reasons, you know what? It can be cordial conversation. When I see somebody with a sleeve tattoo walk into our church, or any tattoo, or if I'm in conversation with somebody, I'll ask about it. What's the story behind it? What's going on? And a lot of these people will do that sort of thing. There is the few that always will look at you as the rebel. You must need Jesus, that sort of thing. Well, you know what? They're going to be everywhere. So deal with them. It's fine. It's okay. Let your actions speak. But for you then to be thinking everybody's looking at you and you start judging them, well, you really don't know where their heart is. The little grandma that's sitting up front that gave you a glance because you're wearing black eye makeup, well, you know what? You could take offense to Granny's stare at you, or you could get to know her, and chances are, usually it's the grandmas in the church, she will love you to pieces. I guarantee you that. It's the occasional evangelist that comes in, though, or the people that in any church are a little more earthly, more heavenly minded than they're no earthly good. They might give you a hard time, but at the same time, it is what it is. Here's the deal. We used to have a Kmart here in Wapaka. Hated it. Awful. Horrible store. They had what you needed, but the minute you got to the cash register, it all fell apart, and you were there for a long time. I often joked around that those who didn't believe in a literal hell have never visited this Kmart before. Does that mean I'm going to write off all Kmarts, though? If I'm out of town and I need something and the closest thing to me is a Kmart, then I'm not going to go because the one in Wapaka is awful? Absolutely not. That's not the case. That's not what I would do. I would go into Kmart, and it might be a pleasurable experience. And so I say all of that, and I share all of my story because I have had every reason to bail on churchianity, okay, on brick and mortar churches. I honestly did. I'll probably have more reasons in the future. But I still stick with it because it was my upbringing, and I know that there is a pocket of guys that I get with every Thursday from our church, every Thursday once a month, for dinner and stuff that I absolutely love. We have good conversation. The outreaches we do are awesome. We're even planning a little egg hunt in a couple weeks here. These sort of things, from our egg hunt to our homeless ministry. There are so many reasons as to why we ought to love the church. So if you're in a church and you're grumbling and complaining about it, and you've tried it for a long time, A long time does not mean 2 or 3 weeks. A long time means a few months. And you still don't like it, well, then leave. Leave. It's okay. It's totally fine. You don't want to be there, and if you're making it a rough experience, they don't want you there. I hate to break it to you, but that church will be just fine without you. But do this. Find another church. Ask around. You know what? If you're going to look for a church, if you're goth, I'm just using this as an example. If you're goth and you're looking for a church that's painted black with black curtains and the lead singers are wearing white makeup, well, you probably won't find it. You might in some big cities, but you probably won't find that one you're going to fit into, appearance-wise. But try another one. Sometimes you're going to find, in fact, the churches that are less trendy in their looks are the ones that are going to love you the most. Because the ones that are trying to be trendy, and by the way, churches, if you're a pastor, pastoring a church, and you say, we're relevant, if you got to say it, you probably aren't. I'm just saying. But find a church. You can try one of the hip, trendy churches and see if you fit in, fine. But a lot of times it's the church that has the standard church name, nothing fancy when you get in there. Those are the ones where you're going to find people with some of the biggest hearts and ones that are going to love on you. It doesn't matter if they dress Eddie Bauer and you dress Taking the Head of Goliath. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter if they're dressing Sandy Patty and you're dressing Broken Flesh. There can be a beautiful thing of unity within the church where they will unite and you can break bread with them. You can do events with them. They'll accept you. You'll accept them. And that, my friend, is the beauty of the church. That is why I stick around in this thing, because I absolutely love that. I'm a metalhead at heart. You wouldn't tell by the way I look. Good old Carhartt, and all that stuff in central Wisconsin. But at the same time, if I sit down with somebody who is a firm lover of Hall & Oates, then you know what? That's fine. Friendship is what matters, and doing things to further the cause of Christ is what really matters. Something to think about. Told you I'm a straight shooter on the Outlaw Pulpit. If you have thoughts on this one or you have questions you want me to address in the future, email me, outlawpulpit@gmail.com. Visit my website, outlawpulpit.com. As well, you can pick up a few items of swag there. I got some t-shirts there and a mug, I believe, and a pin, sticker, that sort of thing. But also visit wearemetalwearefamily.com to pick up some Headbanger Brew coffee, a lot of merch and things like that. Hope you have a good rest of your day.